أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My dear brothers and sisters, I hope you're all doing great, inshallah ta'ala. I've got a really exciting circle for you today, inshallah. So exciting, just very short lecture. Inshallah, we're going to be talking about Aqeeda, but we're going to talk about Aqeeda in the context of philosophy. And as you know, for centuries, human beings have pondered over the existence of God. Is there a God? Is there not a God? Theism has been discussed, atheism has been discussed, and all the possibilities in between have been discussed as well. Why? Because human beings, we've got a natural predisposition to seeking the truth, of course. And this is for different reasons. Some people want to just find the truth. Some people want to prove their personal beliefs. Some people want to find out about good and evil and why they exist, and why does evil exist. If there's a God, then why do bad things happen in life? What happens after death is a big one as well. How many people ponder about what happens after death, subhanallah. And also, in fact, all of this is about pondering about al-ghaib, about the unseen. So philosophy, of course, is a human-created and pondered concept. Hence, it's always going to be subject to some kind of bias. Some people will have a tendency to think in one way, other people will have a tendency to think in another way. And a lot of it is based on maybe how you've been brought up, or what your society is like and how your society is thinking, etc. However, the thing about philosophy, it is all subject to human infallibility, okay? Now, it's subjective and it's not infallible. It's imperfect. Why? Because human beings are imperfect, which makes it really difficult to prove philosophy. In fact, even the philosophers themselves used to change their minds, and one day they'd be thinking something and then they'd do a lot of study on it, and then maybe a few weeks later they'd be thinking something entirely different. Aqeeda, on the other hand, is based on textual evidence. It's based on revelation. It's based on wahi. So it's above, as we Muslims believe, it's above human limitation. Islam doesn't remove reflection. In fact, the Quran encourages reflection, but wahi is unchangeable. So however much you reflect on the Quran, whether you end up agreeing with its words, with the kalam Allah, with the words of Allah, or you end up disagreeing with the words of Allah, the revelation will stay the same. Your thoughts, your reflections will not change the revelation at all. Yet philosophers, like as I said, often change their beliefs. Now, there was a philosopher, a very famous one, called Antony Flew. He was originally atheist, and he wrote a famous book on atheism and just trying to disprove the existence of God. And then later on in life, when he was in his 80s, he changed his mind and he concluded that the world had been created, that everything had been created, and he came up with the theory of intelligent design. Whereas, of course, like I said before, revelation is unchangeable, therefore it's stable, unlike philosophical thought. Now, there's a very nice part of the Quran. In fact, the Quran, subhanAllah, all the way across it, it mentions about the belief and the difference between the falsehood and the truth. But in this particular verse, in Surah 41, verse 42, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, falsehood can't approach it. He's talking here about Islam, about belief, about his existence. Falsehood cannot approach it from before it or from behind it. And he says and finishes off this verse by saying, Tanzilan min Hakimin Hamid. Now, it's really interesting. Those of you who are interested in language, you know that I'm really interested in language. And when I was looking at this verse of the Quran in Arabic, I couldn't help noticing that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions falsehood, he uses the word el, or the. Yet when he mentions these two names, his two attributes, whereas usually we would expect to see El-Hakim and El-Hamid, actually in this particular verse, there's no El, it's not the. And this creates even more distance between the truth of Hakim, the most wise, and Hamid, the most praiseworthy, and the falsehood. So falsehood is the totally opposite to the truth, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's very interesting that Allah has removed and not used the words al in this particular verse. Allah knows best why he's done that. But again, of course, it's interesting to reflect. Now, as far as the names are concerned, the names of Allah that he uses in this verse are really relevant. Why? Because when we have belief, when we become Muslim, or when you're born into Islam and you have your awakening, you will find there are two elements to your Islam. Now, the first element to your Islam is ilm, it's knowledge, it's up here. And then the second essential relevance for your Islam is in your heart, the qalb. Now, with the knowledge, you know about Islam, you know about Allah, you learn about his attributes, you read the Quran, etc. But then with the heart is where the iman comes from. And that's together comes to form the Muslim as a person. And this is important to remember. Now, this is the beginning stance of Islam, of the Muslims, whereas the philosophers, actually, they generally begin from a stance of being human. Of course, they begin from humanity. So it's based on maybe logical thought, which is maybe scientific or maybe religious or maybe just pondering. And then they will maybe rely on science or maths or some other area. However, they cannot, like the Quran, rely on everything, because it's impossible for one human being to have that amount of knowledge to rely on absolutely everything and to have knowledge about absolutely everything. But our starting point is Tawheed, and hence the importance of this lecture and knowing about what our stance is. In Surah 21, verse 25, and in other places in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala confirms his oneness. He says, La ilaha illa anna. La ilaha illa anna. There is no God but me. And this is a repeated message by all the messengers and by all the books that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed as a hidayah, a guidance for mankind. And the stance, of course, and the reward for being a believer is that we're believing in the unseen, but not blindly. We're believing in the unseen with evidences, and that's the important thing to remember. Whereas the people who maybe follow a certain philosophical thought do not have these strong evidences, and it's always very changeable. And so it's all based on interpretation and not something that's sturdy and strong. Now, even at the time of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was a very logical way of Tawheed, of belief. And this is seen very much so, not only in how the Quran was revealed, but also the stages of da'wah. Now, if you recall the story when Mu'ad, the Sahabi Mu'ad radiallahu anh, was sent to Yemen, and the first thing that he was sent to do was to call the people to Tawheed, call the people to believing in the one God, okay? And the second thing that he was asked to do after he'd called them to believing was to call the people to the farad actions. Very often I get people coming to me, my non-Muslim friends, especially in Ramadan time, and they'll say to me, how can you fast for 30 days in the month of Ramadan, you Muslims, and you can tolerate it even though you're starting 2-3 o'clock in the morning, you're finishing 9-10 o'clock at night. It's so long. How do you do this? I could never do this. And of course the answer is Iman. And Iman is something that's very strong within the belief. And I'm not talking just about the belief of the Muslims. Anyone who has a firm conviction in a faith will have a very strong reason for doing the actions that are linked with that faith. So if you're Christian, maybe it might be to go to church, or if you're a Buddhist, it might be to do something else. It just depends on what thing you believe that will lead to you acting on that thing. Now, it's very interesting that a very famous philosopher, Socrates, And one of the things, very famous quote that he said was, "The thing I still know well is that I don't know anything." So his conclusion through all his pondering and all his studies was that he still didn't know very much. And in fact, Charles Darwin, who we know very much, especially those of us who have been brought up in the UK, we've been to school and we've learned about the theory of evolution. But even, Darwin himself, and this is something they don't teach in the schools, brothers and sisters, Charles Darwin had also his doubts about his own theory. So one example of that is that he said that to think that the human eye has evolved seems, and this is a direct quote from Darwin's book, "I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree." So Darwin was saying the human eye is so amazing and so perfect and needs all the elements at once. How can a process of evolution have created something so amazing, something so perfect? Surely there has to be some kind of pondering that there is a higher power that has created this thing rather than it just happening by chance. Now, this of course shows even these great philosophers weren't stable in their thinking. They were thinking one thing one day and then maybe something else the next day. Whereas the stability of Iman and the belief in Allah and its simplicity is a universal message. I'll give you an example. Now, if you approach somebody in the street and you start trying to explain to them about philosophy, they're probably going to blank over, maybe you will blank over, and they're not going to really understand it. If you go to a person in the street and start talking to them about believing the one God and Tawheed and this concept, which is a very simple concept, they will understand it. Now, this is all part of al-fitra. And al-fitra, what is it? It's the natural instinct that every human being has. Now, some scientific research in the last decade or so has shown or suggested that human beings, or some particular human beings, we have a tendency towards believing in God, and this is a genetic tendency, and it's been termed as the God gene. Have a look online about it, it's really interesting. But it's a guy called Mr. Hamer who was researching a genetic predisposition to believing in God. And he found that this particular gene, which is called the VMAT2 gene, actually regulates mood levels. It's basically like the chemicals in our brain that regulate our mood. And some people have this predisposition to automatically believing in a higher power and being a more spiritual person. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimallah, he's of course known as the doctor of the heart, and I love his teachings so much. And he actually describes the heart that has no faith or a desire to heed or listen to the call to faith, or in this case the call to the salah, the prayer, as the heart that is in drought. It has no life in it. It's dry like the desert in a drought. And this is how he describes this type of heart. And why? Because having some kind of spirituality in our lives is a basic human requirement, a human need. And those human beings who don't have some kind of faith, those human beings will go and look for some kind of spiritual satisfaction or fulfillment. They will look for that somewhere else. So they might look and find it in some kind of activity, or try and find it somewhere. Some people, unfortunately, give in to the pull of getting a high from drugs or from alcohol, and they become addicted to these things, and it really ruins their lives. And actually, Iman is so amazing, because I've seen personally people who have come off the streets and have become Muslim, who have been really very severe heroin addicts and addicted on these very strong and destructive substances. And as soon as they take their shahada, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just puts this beautiful sweetness of Iman in their hearts. and they're just able to stop this heroin addiction straight away. Whereas maybe they might have been through rehab programs and all sorts, which have unfortunately failed them. And then they become Muslim, they find a faith, and they have then the reason behind them to stop, a real reason, and then they will stop this drug addiction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us in the Quran, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. This is in Surah Al-Ra'd, verse 11. And he says, bi anfusihim, in themselves. So it's within ourselves. And this ayah relates to all human behaviour, even us as Muslims. If we want to change our condition, if we want things to change for us, whether it's our level of iman and taqwa or something within our lives, we have to start with our own selves first. And this is a very powerful lesson. And it's also a very powerful lesson about Tawheed and how we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam described iman as a sweetness. And this is related in a very nice hadith, and I'm going to say these few words from the hadith. He relates or describes this metaphor, halawat al-iman, the sweetness of iman. This is the beautiful Arabic, and halawat, it's such a gentle and such a nice word. And for anyone who's tasted or felt this iman, this sweetness of iman, will understand why the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that this is present. And this is both a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's a product of Tawheed and the ibadah, the worship that we are doing based on the Tawheed that we're feeling. So inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to finish for now this first session, and next time we're going to be covering what scholarly approaches there are to Aqeedah based on the textual sources, and what the textual sources are, and which scholars base their fiqh or their understanding of the Aqeedah of Islam on which sources. So for now, inshallah, jazakumullah khair, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, bismillahir rahmanir rahim, wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.